Counter-Narrative News, bringing you daily news today on Saturday, the 21st of January 2023. First of all, to Peru, it's the third day of resistance in the streets of the capital Lima by the grassroots resistance movement, who are protesting the ousting of left-wing President Castillo, who is detained waiting trial. On last Thursday was the first day of the so-called Lima takeover by the radical grassroots, many of them coming from the poor peasant communities from Cusco and Puno. After Thursday, they've continued for a second and a third day of resistance, fighting back armed police and riot police who are deploying tear gas, and at least one person has been killed in the process. The Peruvian masses will not stop until they see serious historic concessions and victories going forward against the right-wing President Boluarte, who is supported by global imperialism, particularly the northern senior neighbor in Washington. Going over to news from Africa, very sad news as a man, Nemes Tarimo, from Tanzania, has been announced killed in action in the Russian military operation against Ukraine, and he was jailed for so-called drug offences within Russia. And then similarly like the Zambian Lemakani Nyirenda, they both were offered to leave jail on the condition of joining the Russian armed forces in their operation for the invasion, occupation, annexation of Ukraine. Both men are now dead, killed in action in recent months, and in the case of the Zambian Nyirenda, the family are awaiting their body. This points to a very troubling and deeply concerning dynamic whereby African people are basically forced into a war and then dying on a front line as a means to try and attempt to escape what must be the terrible conditions within the Russian jail system. Going over to China, it's been revealed that the Chinese police in Beijing conducted an anti-terror exercise in the city last year, but the anti-terror exercise was against workers protesting to demand their wages, which has been docked or withheld. The placard in the exercise by the man playing the protester read, "Give me my hard-earned cash," end of quote. This points to an interesting situation whereby the Chinese authorities are very sophisticated and on top of the burgeoning social crisis, which is leading increasingly to the restlessness amongst the Chinese masses. And they are very similar to the Western framework of the manipulation of the so-called war on terror. They are using so-called anti-terror exercises to actually be an exercise to try and put a lid on the growing class struggle of the Chinese workers and peasants. In connected news, the Xinhua, which is the Chinese state media website, has ran a favorable article quoting the very sophisticated representative of the USA state in foreign policy, Henry Kissinger. They quote Kissinger as advocating a dialogue of understanding between the United States and China. Kissinger, unlike Trump, very much wants to ally closely with China strategically to contain and to push back the Moscow regime, whereas the Trump project wants to hug closely the Russian regime to squash China. Both represent a very manipulative and a global oppressive approach by different wings of the US ruling classes. And the fact that the Xinhua news agency very favorably and was a top story on their front page is quoting Kissinger in this regards points to a split in the Chinese state leadership of those on the one hand who want to go closer to an alliance with Putin's regime, and on the other hand another section of the Chinese political class who want to actually maintain better relations with their most important global ally and partner, which is Washington. From the position of Washington, it wants to contain both the states in slightly different tactical strategic approaches. Henry Kissinger himself led the rapprochement between Washington and Beijing in the period of the early 1970s, when Kissinger went to meet the leader of Beijing at the time, Mao Zedong, in July 1971. Then, closely following that, President Nixon of the USA visited the Chinese leadership, including Mao, in February 1972. Both these meetings indicated China withdrawing from its radical revolutionary advocacy of socialism and anti-imperialism and retreating back into a narrow nationalist posture, which was very much continued by Deng Xiaoping and then Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao and now the Xi Jinping leadership. Arguably, since the early 70s, we've seen a close alignment of the Beijing leadership with US global policy as well. And Henry Kissinger very much represents exactly that, a sophisticated approach in terms of containing the radical nature of the Vietnamese resistance against the US occupation, supporting the dictatorship in Chile of Pinochet in the 70s, supporting the genocidal war against the Bangladeshi War of Liberation, and it goes on and on and on in the case of Henry Kissinger. Going to Africa, we have recently seen the martyrdom anniversary on the 20th of January 1973 of one of the most radical Pan-Africanist leaders of Amilcar Cabral, who was the leader of the party, the African Party of Independence for Guinea and Cape Verde Islands, and also a founding member of what used to be the radical Marxist anti-colonial movement of the MPLA in Angola. Amilcar Cabral was martyred in 20th January 1973, and in September 1973, Guinea and Cape Verde won its independence against Portuguese colonialism. Portuguese colonialism was also deployed and colonizing Angola and also Mozambique. All of these forces represented the radical leftist Marxist wing of the Pan-Africanist movement, closely allied with other radical socialist states in the world, particularly Cuba, and Cuba hosting the radical Third World Socialist Tricontinental Conference, where Cabral spoke in 1966, developing his very interesting and well-known speech called the quote-unquote "the weapon of theory." Cabral has a very interesting ideological advocacy and leadership. He very famously said, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories," pointing to a counter-movement against opportunism and deceit and manipulation of the leadership of the revolutionary forces, placing themselves very much at the grassroots. And also Cabral also developed the theory of the return to revolutionary culture of the masses as a means by mobilizing and organizing and leading the masses towards the liberation of the working people and the liberation of women in a joint, united framework of anti-colonial and socialist revolution. That was Counter Narrative News, bringing the daily news. Please continue to subscribe, like, comment and share. Please do follow us on Twitter on the handle @counter_CNN. We wish you all the best.